My name is Olivia Reed. I am 31 years old. I had spent years treating silence as the most practical option. It kept the family property near Aurora running without unnecessary friction. The small rewrites of who had done what work on the records or the maintenance schedules never seemed worth correcting out loud. Then, the weekend before Labor Day, a recording I never meant to make changed the arithmetic. I was in the kitchen of my own house, that Friday afternoon, phone on the counter, while I spoke with my sister about the old boxes she wanted brought to the family property. My mother had decided a photographer should come document the place and our history before any more time passed. I had offered to pull the relevant files together. The call ended the way most calls with my sister did, short, functional, already moving on to the next item. I set the phone down and went back to the list I was dictating into a voice memo for myself. I did not notice the recording app was still active. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with the windows open reviewing what I had captured. The memo file was longer than it should have been. I tapped play. My own voice listing box numbers gave way to the sound of my sister's voice continuing after she thought the line had gone dead. She was still on the call with my mother. My mother's voice came through clearly first. "She'll bring the boxes if we ask. She always does. Just make sure the photographer hears the right version of how the filing system got organized. Amanda, you were the one who kept things straight after your father stopped being able to." My sister laughed, the short sound she made when she agreed without wanting to say the words. "Olivia will correct it if we're not careful. She has that way of inserting herself into stories that were never really hers. We can steer Karen away from that. Tell her the practical work was always handled here at the property, not from Olivia's house." My mother continued as if this were ordinary conversation. "It's cleaner that way. People get confused when too many versions exist. We've already told Karen the family has always handled its own history internally. No need to complicate it with details that don't fit the pictures." I listened to the rest without moving. They discussed how to answer questions the photographer might ask about certain ledgers and who had maintained the older property surveys. Every sentence quietly reassigned the work I had done across multiple summers, scanning documents, cross-referencing dates, driving to the county office for copies onto my sister, or onto a vague collective effort that did not include me. It was not dramatic. It was efficient. They were coordinating the narrative the same way they had coordinated smaller adjustments for years. I stopped the recording and sat with it. The evening air on the porch was still warm. I could hear the neighbor's dog 2 houses down. Nothing around me had changed, but the recording had made the pattern visible in a way that could not be folded back into "it's easier not to argue." The next morning, I was sorting through one of the smaller boxes I had already pulled from my attic when I found the note. It was on the back of an old property tax receipt from 12 years earlier, written in my mother's hand. The note listed 3 tasks I had completed that summer and added a short line at the bottom. Olivia handled the county copies and the cross-check. "Keep this with the file." The handwriting was unmistakable. I had not seen the note before. I must have tucked the receipt into the box without reading the back. I placed it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. It contradicted the version my mother and sister had recorded the night before. The contradiction was small on paper. It was not small in what it confirmed about how long the rewriting had been happening. That same afternoon, an email arrived from David Lang. He was the local man my mother had asked to help scan and organize some of the older photographs and documents for the session with the photographer. The email was addressed to my sister, but it had landed in my inbox instead. The subject line read, "Revised caption list for Karen. Please review before weekend." The body listed suggested descriptions for several of the older images. One line stood out for the 2012 survey work credit, Amanda Reed. With compiling the final set, Olivia only assisted with transport. Another line suggested softening any mention of who had maintained the running log of repairs over the last decade. David Lang had clearly been given direction on the preferred narrative and was checking before he finalized the captions. I read the email twice. Then I saved it without replying. The combination of the recording, the note on the tax receipt, and the misdirected email made the coordinated effort impossible to treat as separate incidents. They had been aligning the story for years, adjusting details whenever an outsider might hear them, and counting on my continued silence to keep the adjustments from being challenged. I did not call my mother or my sister. I finished packing the boxes I had agreed to bring. I loaded them into the car late that afternoon and drove the short distance to the family property. The porch light was already on when I arrived. My mother's car and my sister's car were both parked in the usual spots. Karen Ellis, the photographer my mother had hired, was unloading equipment from her own vehicle near the side of the house. She waved when she saw me. I waved back. Inside, my mother and my sister were at the kitchen table with a stack of printed photographs spread between them. They looked up when I set the first box down. My mother smiled the same measured smile she used when she wanted a conversation to stay on the surface. My sister nodded once and returned to the photographs. Neither of them asked how the drive had been. Neither of them mentioned the boxes I had just carried in. I placed the second box on the floor and straightened. The house smelled the way it always did on holiday weekends, faintly of lemon cleaner and the cedar chest in the hallway. Nothing in the room suggested anything unusual had been discussed the night before. That was the point. The rewriting worked best when it stayed ordinary. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned to bring in the last box from the car. The recording was still on my phone. The note was in my jacket pocket. The email was saved in a folder I had created that afternoon. I had not decided what to do with any of them yet. I only knew that treating the weekend as another set of tasks to complete quietly was no longer the practical choice. The last box was lighter than the others. I carried it inside and set it beside the first two without comment. My mother glanced at the stack and said the photographer could start with the older ledgers in the morning. My sister nodded and went back to sorting the printed photographs on the table. Karen Ellis was still outside unloading lights and a backdrop. The house felt the same as it had on every other Labor Day weekend I had driven over from my own place. Only the recording on my phone and the note in my pocket made the ordinary feel arranged. The next morning, Karen Ellis arrived early with coffee and her equipment. She set up in the living room where the light came through the large front windows. My mother had already laid out the boxes I brought and arranged several ledgers on the coffee table in the order she preferred. My sister stood nearby with a printed list of suggested captions. When Karen asked who had originally compiled the property surveys from the early 2000s, my mother answered before I could speak. Amanda kept those organized after we realized how scattered they had become, my mother said. Her tone was even the way she spoke when she wanted no follow-up questions. Olivia helped carry some of the boxes to the car once or twice, but the real work of matching dates and locations was Amanda's. Karen Ellis made a note and adjusted her camera. She did not look at me. My sister added a small detail about the filing system she claimed to have updated one summer. I stood near the doorway and listened. The version they were giving matched the conversation I had recorded. It also matched the direction in the email David Lang had sent by mistake. I waited until Karen stepped away to check her light meter. Then I spoke. The 2012 survey set was the one I cross-checked against the county records, I said. My voice stayed level. I drove to the office twice that summer to get the missing pages. My mother smiled the same measured smile from the night before. You remember it that way because you were the one who made the trips, but Amanda was the one who put the final set together here at the property. It's easy to mix up who did the traveling and who did the organizing when you're only here part of the time. My sister laughed once the short sound again. It doesn't really matter for the pictures, does it? Karen just needs the general story so the captions make sense. Karen Ellis returned with her camera and asked if we were ready for the first grouping. She positioned my mother and my sister near the ledgers. She asked me to stand slightly to the side so the light would fall evenly. I stayed where I was for a moment longer than the request required, then moved. The shutter clicked several times. My mother and my sister spoke in low voices between shots about which photographs should come first in the final album. They did not include me in the discussion. Later that afternoon, Karen Ellis took a break to review the images on her laptop. My mother and my sister stayed at the table with the remaining boxes. I went to the kitchen to refill water glasses. While I was there, I heard my mother say my name in the same even tone she had used with Karen. Olivia will want to correct every caption if we let her see the list, my mother said. It's better if we finalize the wording before she looks at it. She tends to make small things larger than they need to be when other people are listening. My sister agreed without hesitation. She's always been that way. If we show her the draft now, she'll spend the whole weekend arguing over details that don't change anything. We can send her a copy after Karen finishes, and the album is already ordered. I stood at the sink with the empty glasses. The water ran cold over my hands. I had heard versions of this exchange before in different rooms and on different weekends, always framed as concern for efficiency or for keeping things simple. The recording had simply made the pattern impossible to treat as separate moments of forgetfulness. They were not forgetting. They were choosing the version that kept the contributions assigned to my sister and the practical work treated as background support that did not require separate credit. When I carried the glasses back into the room, my mother looked up and asked if I had remembered to bring the older tax receipts she had mentioned on the phone. I set the glasses down and said I had. Then I added that the 2012 receipt had a note on the back in her handwriting listing the work I had done that summer. I did not raise my voice. I did not pull the note from my pocket. I simply stated the fact and waited. My mother's expression did not change. She said the note must have been from a different year and that memories of who wrote what tended to blur after enough time. My sister said something about how old paperwork could be misleading without context, and changed the subject to which photographs Karen should prioritize next. Neither of them asked to see the note. Neither of them offered to correct the captions they had already discussed with Karen. Karen Ellis came back into the room a few minutes later and asked if anyone wanted to look at the images she had taken so far. My mother and my sister moved to the laptop. I stayed by the table. Karen glanced at me once, then turned the screen so my mother and my sister could see the groupings. She mentioned that one of the wider shots had caught the three of us near the ledgers and asked if we wanted her to include it or crop it tighter. My mother said the wider shot was fine as long as the captions stayed consistent with what they had already discussed. I watched them approve the images. The versions they accepted matched the narrative from the recording and from David Lang's email. Karen Ellis did not know the versions were coordinated. She was only following the direction she had been given. That was how the rewriting stayed effective. It relied on the person outside the family accepting the story that was offered, and on the person inside the family continuing to stay quiet. That evening, after Karen Ellis had packed her equipment and left for the day, my mother suggested we eat on the porch. My sister brought out plates. I sat with them and listened to the plan for the next day's session. They spoke about the remaining boxes and which photographs should be paired with the ledgers. They did not ask for my input on the order. When the conversation paused, I said I had received an email from David Lang the day before that seemed intended for my sister. I described the subject line and the line about crediting my sister with work I had done on the surveys. My mother set her fork down. She said David Lang must have been working from an older list and that she would call him in the morning to clarify. My sister said it was probably a simple mix-up and that it did not need to be discussed further. Neither of them asked to see the email. Neither of them offered to include me in the clarification call. The response was the same measured dismissal I had heard in the recording. The pattern held even when the evidence was placed directly in front of them. I finished the meal and carried my plate inside. While I was rinsing the dishes, I heard my mother and my sister resume their conversation on the porch. Their voices were lower now. I could not make out every word, but the tone was the same one they had used when they thought the phone call had ended. They were adjusting the plan for the remaining photographs and the captions. They were deciding how to handle any further questions I might raise. I dried my hands and walked to the back hallway where the older boxes were still stacked. I opened the one I had not fully unpacked and removed the folder of tax receipts. The note I had found was still inside. I read it again under the hallway light. The handwriting and the date matched the year I remembered. The tasks listed were the same ones I had described to Karen Ellis that morning. The note existed, the recording existed, the email existed. The versions my mother and my sister were building for the photographer did not match any of them. I put the note back in the folder and returned to the porch. My mother and my sister were still talking. They stopped when I stepped through the door. My mother asked if everything was all right. I said it was and sat down in the remaining chair. The evening air was cooler than the night before. Karen Ellis's car was gone from the driveway. The boxes we had not yet opened were stacked inside the house where my mother had directed. The photographer would return in the morning to finish the session. I did not mention the note or the email again that night. I listened to the rest of their plan for the album and the captions. When the conversation ended, I went to the guest room at the end of the hall and closed the door. I placed my phone on the nightstand with the recording and the saved email in the same folder. The note from the tax receipt stayed in my jacket pocket. I lay down without turning off the lamp. The house was quiet. My mother and my sister were still in the living room, their voices low enough that I could not hear the words. I stayed awake long enough to hear the front door lock and the lights go out in the hallway. The next morning I woke to the sound of Karen Ellis's car pulling into the driveway again. I dressed and went to the kitchen. My mother was already at the table with coffee. My sister was reviewing the remaining captions on her phone. Neither of them mentioned the conversation from the night before. Neither of them asked what I had done after I left the porch. The day began the same way the previous one had ended, with the same measured coordination and the same expectation that I would continue to treat it as ordinary. I poured coffee and carried it to the living room where Karen Ellis was setting up her equipment once more. She greeted me and asked if I wanted to be in any of the wider shots that day. Before I could answer, my mother said the wider shots had already been decided and that the focus should stay on the ledgers and the photographs that had already been approved. Karen Ellis nodded and adjusted the tripod. My sister placed the stack of approved captions beside the laptop. I stood near the doorway again and watched them begin. The shutter clicked. The low voices continued between shots. The versions they offered to Karen Ellis remained consistent with the recording I had not meant to make. I kept the note in my pocket and the email saved on my phone. I did not correct them out loud. Not yet. The weekend was only halfway through, and the final set of photographs had not been taken. The old document that would change the remaining captions had not yet surfaced. I stayed in the doorway and let the morning continue on the terms they had set. For now. The photo session continued through the morning with the same measured coordination. Karen Ellis moved her lights and adjusted angles while my mother and my sister approved each grouping before the shutter clicked. I stayed near the doorway and watched the versions solidify into the album they intended to order. When Karen asked for one of the older tax receipts to include in a close-up shot, my mother directed her to the folder I had left on the table. I stepped forward and opened it myself. The receipt with the note on the back was near the top. As I lifted it, a small sealed envelope that had been tucked behind it slipped out and landed on the floor in front of Karen Ellis. She picked it up before I could reach it. The envelope was yellowed at the edges and addressed in my father's handwriting to both my mother and me. Karen Ellis glanced at the front, then held it out to me. My mother said it was probably nothing important and that we could look at it later. My sister agreed and reached for the next photograph. I took the envelope from Karen Ellis and opened it where I stood. Inside was a single page dated 12 years earlier. It was a short letter from my father, confirming that I had taken over the organization of the property records and surveys after he could no longer manage the files. He had written that the work should stay with me if any questions arose later, and that he trusted me to keep the history accurate. He had signed it and added a line at the bottom. "This is not a shared task anymore. Olivia has the records." The handwriting matched the note on the tax receipt. The date matched the summer I remembered driving to the county office. Karen Ellis read the letter over my shoulder without being asked. She looked at my mother and my sister, then back at the page. My mother said the letter was old and that my father had been confused about who was actually handling the files by that point. My sister said it did not change the captions they had already approved and that Karen should stick to the list they had given her. Karen Ellis did not move to the next photograph. She asked if she could see the recording and the email I had mentioned the day before. I played the recording on my phone. The voices of my mother and my sister filled the room exactly as they had the night I captured them. When it ended, I showed her the email from David Lang on the screen. My mother's voice stayed even. She said the recording was out of context and that they had only been trying to keep the album simple for everyone involved. My sister said I had always been sensitive about small details and that bringing it up now was making the weekend more difficult than it needed to be. Karen Ellis looked at the letter again, then at the approved captions on the laptop. She closed the laptop without saving the final selections and said she would not be able to finish the project under the current direction. She packed her equipment while my mother and my sister watched. When Karen Ellis reached the door, she turned and said she would be returning the deposit and that she did not want her name attached to an album that did not match the record she had seen. She left without another word. The house was quiet after the door closed. My mother sat down at the table and folded her hands. She said I had embarrassed everyone by making a private family matter into something public in front of an outsider. My sister said the letter did not override the work they had already done and that I should have brought it up earlier if it mattered so much. I placed the letter and the note on the table between us. I told them I would be taking the remaining boxes and the original files back to my own house. I would finish organizing them myself and decide what, if anything, would be shared going forward. I would not be part of any album or narrative that reassigned the work I had done. My mother asked what I expected them to tell people in town when questions came up about the project. I said they could tell the truth or continue with the version they preferred. Either way, I would no longer stay silent to protect it. My sister said I was choosing to damage the family over old paperwork that no one else cared about. I answered that the damage had already been done by the years of adjustments and that I was only refusing to keep it in place. I gathered the boxes I had brought and loaded them into my car. My mother and my sister remained at the table. Neither of them offered to help. Neither of them asked me to stay. I drove back to my own house that afternoon. The porch was empty when I arrived. I carried the boxes inside and set them in the spare room where I kept my own files. I called David Lang and explained that the email he had sent had reached me by mistake and that the direction it contained did not match the actual records. He apologized and said he would remove the captions he had prepared. Later that week, Karen Ellis contacted me directly. She said she had spoken with a few people at the local historical society about the inconsistencies she had seen, and that word was already moving through the small circle of people who cared about the older properties in the area. She offered to help scan and organize the files properly if I wanted assistance. I thanked her and told her I would handle it myself for now. My husband Nathan came home from work that evening and asked how the weekend had gone. I told him the project with the photographer had ended early and that I would not be joining my mother and my sister for the same kind of work again. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I was all right. I said I was. The loss of the version of family I had tried to maintain was real, but the relief of no longer carrying the silence was also real. I had chosen the truth over the comfort of pretending the rewrites did not matter. That choice had cost the easy closeness we once kept by never correcting the record out loud. It had also ended the coordinated effort to erase what I had done. In the weeks that followed, the questions about the Family History Project did circulate in town exactly as Karen Ellis had said they would. People who had known my father asked why the album had been canceled and why the records were now being handled from my house instead of the family property. My mother and my sister answered with the same measured explanations they had always used. The answers no longer held the way they once had. The letter and the recording existed. The contradictions were visible to anyone who looked. The reputation damage did not require me to force it. It spread because the version they had built could not survive contact with the documents that still existed. I set a clear boundary with both of them. I would not participate in joint projects that required me to accept rewritten accounts of my own work. I would not attend gatherings where the same pattern of adjustment was expected to continue. I would maintain the records on my own terms and share what I chose to share. My mother responded with the same even tone she had used during the photo session. She said she hoped I would reconsider for the sake of keeping things peaceful. My sister said I was making a permanent problem out of something that could have stayed private. I told them both that peace built on silence had never been peace. It had only been the absence of open disagreement. I was done with that arrangement. The emotional safety I once felt inside the family is gone. I no longer assume that shared history will be treated as shared fact. I check records before I accept any version of events that includes my name. That loss is permanent. The relief of no longer being the person who stays quiet to keep the surface smooth is also permanent. I chose the truth when it still cost something to say it out loud. That choice did not restore what had been rewritten for years. It did stop the rewriting from continuing under my name. Thank you for listening to my story. If this sounds familiar, write relate in the comments.